Chapter 5. So, am I a genius? I asked the others. We were in the back hay shed, sheltering from more rain. It was very dark, probably about 10 o'clock, on the night of our conversation with Kevin. I couldn't see anyone's face except Fee's, but I could sense their excitement. I was excited too. I thought it was a good plan. I don't know about genius, Homer grumbled, but it's not a bad idea. How would we get word to Kevin? Robin asked. I'm not sure. Just have to wait for a chance. It shouldn't be too hard. We could write it down, Fee said, and if we get half a minute alone with him, we could slip it to him then. Privately, I thought it was a bit risky, in case it got into the wrong hands, but I agreed to do it. I wrote it early the next morning, with the others adding more suggestions every few minutes. Some of the suggestions were pretty smart, so I chucked them in. Writing it out made me nervous, though. It was like we were going into action again. For the first time in a long while, it was a different kind of action to the other battles we'd fought. This was more a battle of wits, but a lot hinged on it. If it went wrong, things would turn ugly for Kevin's family back at the showground. They were the ones actually running the biggest risk, and they didn't even know it. In the end, after we'd waited a day and a half without any contact with Kevin, we delivered the letter in a different way. When the work parties were in the paddocks with their guards, Fee and I slipped out of the bush again, using the old houses as covers from the colonists in the main homestead. Stole into the prisoners' quarters. We found Kevin's bed easily enough. It was the messiest. We got one of his socks and put the paper in it. Then we made the bed roughly and hid the sock in there. We figured the sentries wouldn't notice if the bed had been made in the morning, but Kevin certainly would. He'd realised there must be something special going on. The other thing I had to do was check the old well set in the ground of the little courtyard. It was one of the biggest I'd seen, but like a lot of these old wells, was in dangerous condition. The stonework was crumbling and collapsing around its edges. There was a cover over it, a big steel cap that could be opened in the middle by pulling two handles in opposite directions. While Phil held me by the back of my shirt, I wrestled with the two handles until the cover slowly ground open. A rush of stale, damp air exhaled onto my face. The gases were all I hoped they would be. I felt instant nausea at just a sniff of them. I held my breath and leaned forward, peering down the shaft. It was beautifully dark and deep. I couldn't see the bottom. I dropped the pebble and waited nearly 6 seconds before I heard it hit water, which was perfect. I scrambled backwards. The air made me so dizzy that I had to get Fee to pull the cover back in place. I didn't want to go near it again. Nothing happened then until the next morning when Kevin gave me the signal we'd suggested in our letter. We asked him to wear something green for yes, red for no, yellow if he wanted to meet us and talk it over. I'd been betting that Kevin, who was a cautious guy, would be dressed all in yellow, but he surprised us. He came out with a green cap, a lurid green shirt, and an olive pair of trousers. The outfit looked terrible, but I realised then, if I hadn't realised it before, just how desperate he was to get away and rejoin us. We were watching from the scrub, and when we saw all the green, we looked at each other in a mixture of fear and excitement. For once we wouldn't have much to do. Honestly, we'd have to sit and watch. The only way we'd have a lot to do was if the guards realised that something was wrong and came looking for us. In a way, I would have preferred more action. Sitting and watching was never my style. We did have one job, though, to get a sheep, or a pig, or root, or calf, but a sheep seemed the easiest. We waited until the work parties set out for the day, then we went the opposite direction. Out in a distant paddock we found a small mob of 2 tooths. We hung around till mid-afternoon, then Homer and I, helped and hindered by others, cut out a sheep and got it in the corner. We decided not to kill it there and then because it would leave evidence in the paddock, so we tied its legs and Homer, with a bit of a struggle, got it up across his shoulders and staggered off in the bush with it. There are advantages in having a strong male around sometimes. When we were all well into the trees, Homer dropped the sheep and he and I killed it. I cut its throat and he broke its neck, while Fee stood there making little whimpering noises of disgust, as though someone had spat on the floor of her parents' beautiful drawing room. Sorry, Fee, I said, grinning. We left the blood for the flies. Homer shouldered the carcass and led the way back to the farmhouses. The tension was killing me. It's much worse when it's your own plan. The responsibility is too much. Too much. I resolved that I'd never suggest anything again, knowing even as I made the resolution that I wouldn't be able to keep it. I talked to Robin as we walked along through, and that was interesting. She had this great religious theory about how the sheep was a sacrificial lamb, sacrificed to save Kevin's life. I didn't know about that. Once we were inside of the farmhouse, we had to take a lot of care. It was no easy matter for Homer to carry the sheep all the way to the well. Lee went to a tree which gave him a good view of the main homestead, and he waved to us when it was all clear. It took 20 minutes before he signalled, which meant time was starting to get tight. It was 4:25 already. Flies were driving Homer crazy. It's amazing how quickly they sniff out the bleeding and the dead, even in winter. But at last, with a short rush, he was able to hoist the carcass and take it to the well. Robin and I got the top open, and Homer with a sorrel leaf tossed it in, head first, so it would fall all the way. We slammed the top shut again and raced back to shelter. From now on, we were reduced to being an audience. At 5:19, the men returned. They all went straight into their quarters. Apparently, this was not a bath night. Was it my imagination, or did they look nervous? Wasn't Kevin walking kind of stiffly, grimly? I could hardly breathe. My chest felt tight, but nothing happened till 5:35. Then Kevin began his run for the Academy Award. First he sauntered out past the galvanized iron shed and had a bit of poke around it, as though he'd never seen a galvanized iron shed before. He looked at the corner post nearest the sentry, then chucked the guttering. The sentry called out, obviously asking what he was doing, and Kevin muttered something before dawdling away. He was meant to look like a bored teenager who was going to get into trouble, but he seemed a bit self-conscious about it to me. After that we lost sight of him for 10 minutes, but we knew what was meant to happen. Kevin would wander over to the well, force open the cover, and take a look down it. The crumbling stonework would give way, and Kevin would fall to his death. Either the fall or the fumes would kill him. It didn't matter to us, as long as he was definitely dead. We waited nervously. Sure enough, after 5 minutes came a sharp cry. It only lasted the briefest moment, seemingly cut off in mid-voice, but it was unusual enough to catch the attention of the sentry. He stood more alertly and turned in the direction of the cry, then did a full circle and looked carefully all around him. He was no fool. In the How to Invade Other Countries textbook, he'd obviously read the section on decoys twice. But a few seconds later, a man, one of the prisoners, came running out past the shed and called desperately to the sentry. Without even looking to see if the sentry was following, he ran straight back again. It was nicely done, and seemed to finally convince the soldier. He only hesitated a moment, then quickly followed the prisoner. We waited in a state of high tension. We could hear a lot of shouting, and we caught glimpses of people running to and fro. It lasted about 30 minutes, then seemed to calm down a bit, but it was more than an hour before the sentry came back and took up his position again. And that was the end of the night's excitement. Everything went very quiet and stayed that way. We presumed it'd work, but we didn't know. It was another great night for us insomniacs. Next morning, the work parties were late to leave. When they did, they looked subdued and dejected. There was no sign of Kevin, of course, but suddenly I had an awful thought. "My God," I said to Homer, "I hope he didn't actually fall down it." Another slow hour passed. Then I saw a movement by the corner of the shed. I called out softly to the others, but there was no need. They had already seen it. We all craned forward. It was an agonizing moment. Kevin or not Kevin? Success or failure? Life or death? He sprinted towards us, grinning from ear to ear. It was as though he were unloading months of misery with this one short run to freedom. I wanted to cheer, but it wouldn't have been a good idea. We were still in deadly peril, hanging around there, and more importantly, Kevin's family were in deadly peril. I took a step forward to greet him. The soldier seemed to come from nowhere. He didn't, of course. There was an old rainwater tank open to the sky that had been dumped between the buildings and the bush. It had been there so long that weeds had started to grow through and over it. It had become part of the landscape, so we hadn't even noticed it, but the soldier must have concealed himself in it some time before dawn. He was one smart cookie. He stood with his back to us. Kevin had stopped in an instant and stood there, mouth open, the colour draining from his face. The soldier had a rifle pointing at Kevin, and the rifle was cocked. The only thing we had going for us that he obviously didn't know we were behind him. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think of a single thing that might help. All I knew was that I had completely screwed up and people were going to die. I heard the soldier say, "You think I stupid? They think I stupid, but I know stupid. You stupid." I still couldn't think of anything to say or do. Behind me there was a slight movement, a stealthy sound. I turned my head to see, not moving my body in case the soldier sensed it. Homer had opened the back top of his pack and was in the process of withdrawing his shotgun. He had it half out of the pack already. Further across I saw Lee fisting in his pack for something. I made frantic signals at Homer with my face, widening my eyes and wiggling my eyebrows. I didn't know what the solution was, but it wasn't the shotgun. There were a dozen or more colonists up at the main house. They were sure to be better armed than us. I heard the soldier say to Kevin, "You walk to house." At that moment, Lee began to move forward. Sick with knowledge, I made myself look at his hands to see what he had. I expected to see a knife, like the one he used to kill the young soldier back in Holloway Valley. But he held no knife. He had not found what he'd been looking for in his pack, and now his hands were at his waist. What he was quickly pulling off was worse than a knife. It was his leather-plated belt. Lee's eyes were wide open, like spotlights. He moved with the stealth of a feral cat, so quietly that I only heard the slightest crunch as he took each footstep. I somehow found the time to be jealous of his grace and lightness of tread, but I realized I was going to have to do more than watch. In some ways, what Lee had was the perfect weapon. The belt ran through 2 small rings of steel and came back between them to get its tension. It was the kind of belt that we all wore, most of us. Most of us had made our own in leatherwork. It took Lee, though, to think of using one as a weapon. I had a horrible sick awareness that it was probably going to be perfect, but there was one big problem. Lee was going to try strangle this guy with a belt while the guy stood there holding a gun. It was probably the bravest, stupidest thing I'd ever seen anyone try to do. I knew I had to help. The soldier was losing his temper fast. "Turn around," he shouted at Kevin. "You bad boy. You turn round." Kevin looked terrified. He had seen Lee moving up behind the soldier, and I don't know who he was more scared of, Lee or the soldier, but at last the man was sure he was the one who'd caused Kevin's loss of colour and shaking lips. He hadn't yet thought that there might be anyone behind him, hadn't yet thought to turn around. I began moving forward with Lee. I knew what I had to do, get the man's gun arm. I tried desperately to move as quickly as Lee. Kevin was turning around, ordered, slowly, but he was turning. Hand up, the soldier yelled. Lee and I were only a couple of steps away now, and I thought that we should strike the man while he was yelling. He would be less likely to hear us while his own voice was filling his ears. I had an awful moment of hesitation when I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. I wanted to freeze, but I knew I simply couldn't. The only way I could make myself act was to count. I went 1, 2, 3, very quickly to myself and dived. Lee launched himself in a split second later. Kevin fell sideways, desperate to avoid the aim of the gun, but the man didn't shoot Kevin by reflex, which is what I'd most feared. He didn't shoot anyone. He didn't even pull the trigger. He did what I suppose most people would do in that situation. He started spinning around to see what was going on behind him. That was the way his reflexes worked. I rabbit chopped his arm as hard as I could hit, then grabbed the gun and swung it upwards. I'd been hoping he'd drop the gun with the shock of my hit, but he didn't. But he lost his grip on it and had to snatch at it to try and get it back. At that moment, Lee knocked the man's cap off and dropped the belt over his head. Now fighting 2 battles at once, the man got confused. He tried to push me away and at the same time tried to attack Lee. Then Homer arrived with a rush, and between us we prized the gun out of the man's grasping fingers. He knew he was in trouble then. Lee was tightening the belt fast. The man tried to get his hands onto the belt, but Homer and I grabbed an arm each and dragged them down again. Lee started to pull all his weight on the belt. The soldier tried to call for help. Too late. I started getting hysterical myself, but some force within me made me hold on. The soldier was pitching to the right, staggering. I lost my grip on his arm, and he brought it up to his throat, but it did him no good. Lee was implacable. The man's face was mottled now, dark red with patches of white, getting darker by the moment. A horrible gurgling noise came from his mouth, like someone trying to gargle, but doing it in the mouth instead of the throat. I didn't. I couldn't watch any longer, but looked away towards the beautiful bush, the bush that I loved. Did these things happen in the bush? Did animals and birds kill each other in cold blood because of fights over territory? You bet your life they did. I had hold of the soldier's arm again, feeling the strength in it, its desperate struggle, as it flailed and writhed and fought. The fight was lasting much longer than I expected. I could feel the veins swell in the tortured arm. Then suddenly it was over. The arm went limp. A terrible smell filled the air, and I realized the man had fouled his trousers. I stole a look at his face and quickly looked away again. It was the most revolting sight I'd ever seen. His tongue hung out like a giant fat bull boar sausage. His skin was purplish black, and his eyes, those eyes will follow me to my grave and beyond. They were the eyes of a staring devil, a man sent mad in the last minute of his life by the knowledge that he was dying, and by the manner of his death. Every time I close my eyes, he's open in my mind.